The year was 1911. Deep within the shadows of a remote cave in Lovelock, Nevada, a discovery was made that threatened to shatter the very foundation of human history. Miners, digging through the darkness, unearthed skeletal remains of enormous proportions, with some measuring over 9 feet tall. These were not ordinary men, but towering anomalies of bone and marrow, ancient figures with strands of red hair still clinging to their heavy skulls. But as quickly as they were pulled from the dry earth, these silent witnesses vanished from the public eye. Where did they go? Why does the dust of the earth so often swallow the secrets we are not ready to understand? What if the mud and stone could not completely bury what a global catastrophe once tried to erase? Consider the unsettling possibility that the DNA of a mythical bloodline, a race of giants known to the ancients as the Nephilim, did not perish in the floodwaters. What if that ancient code still flows quietly through the veins of the modern world? Welcome to Cryptic Realm, your sanctuary for the forgotten chapters of time. As you settle into the quiet embrace of the night, I invite you to leave the certainty of the waking world behind and journey with us into the shadows. Close your eyes, breathe slowly, and let us wander through the corridors of a history that refuses to stay buried. Subscribe to our channel and walk with us as we ask the questions that history books dare not whisper. Have you ever wondered about the true nature of rain? When the heavens opened and the greatest flood in human memory washed over the earth, was it truly a divine cleansing of all corruption? Or did the rushing waters leave behind a singular microscopic loophole in the architecture of human life? Listen to the sound of rain against the glass of history, a steady, rhythmic drumming that echoes from the deepest chasms of our collective past. Long before the ink dried on the fragile pages of the texts we know today, there was the water. The Genesis account speaks of a world that had grown too heavy with an unbearable corruption, a time when the delicate human bloodline was irreversibly altered by the descent of heavenly beings. They saw that the daughters of humans were beautiful, and they took them as wives, creating an unholy combination of spirit and human. These offspring were the Nephilim, towering, lumbering giants who brought a great dilemma to the people of the earth. The ancient texts describe them as physically intimidating and notoriously wicked, an anomaly that pushed the Creator to a point of profound sorrow and ultimate, devastating resolve. It was time to clean up. The divine decree was absolute and terrifying, to bring floodwaters on the earth to destroy all life under the heavens, ensuring that every creature with the breath of life would perish. But listen closely to the whispers of antiquity, and you will begin to realize that this terrifying downpour is not confined merely to the dry valleys of the ancient Middle East. It is a dark, watery nightmare woven into the very fabric of human consciousness, echoing across oceans, continents, and uncounted millennia. In the cradle of civilization, the ancient Sumerians meticulously carved the Epic of Gilgamesh into heavy clay tablets, speaking of a devastating deluge unleashed by exhausted gods to silence the deafening, arrogant noise of a corrupted world. Utnapishtim, a man much like the biblical patriarch, was warned by a whisper in the reeds to build a massive vessel, gathering the seed of all living things before the skies tore open and bled rain. The Mesopotamian storms were described as so utterly violent that even the gods themselves cowered in fear, fleeing to the highest heavens, weeping at the absolute destruction they had set into motion below. Travel further east to the lush, ancient river valleys of India, and the wind murmurs the exact same aquatic truth. The Hindu traditions tell the sweeping epic of Manu, the first man, who was warned by a divine fish of a massive flood that would dissolve the known world back into a primordial dark ocean. Guided by this great horned fish, Manu's ship navigated the churning, violent cosmic waves, preserving the fragile essence of life while the earth drowned beneath him. And if you cross the vast, rolling Pacific to the rugged, untamed terrains of the Americas, you will hear the indigenous elders sitting by the fire, speaking of the great mystery. They speak of a creator who looked upon a world infested with unnatural monsters and deep moral decay, choosing to wash it all away with a relentless, purifying rain. Why does humanity, separated by insurmountable mountains, vast deserts, and endless seas, share the exact same haunting memory of a watery apocalypse? Perhaps it is because the threat they faced was truly global. The towering anomalies, these descendants of the fallen angels, had spread their unnatural dominion far and wide across the prehistoric Earth. The Great Flood was not merely a natural disaster, nor was it a chaotic shift in ancient climate. It was a highly targeted, divine reboot. It was never meant to be a half-hearted cleanse. The waters were summoned from the deep and poured from the sky to completely eradicate a specific, terrifying mistake in the planetary ecosystem. Imagine, if you can, the sheer, paralyzing terror of those final days. The rain falling heavily, without pause, turning gentle streams into raging serpents and quiet lakes into swallowing abysses. The floodwaters rising relentlessly, swallowing the green valleys, drowning the highest ancient forests, and eventually rising above buildings and every existing structure. Picture the frantic desperation of the giants. Beings of immense, earth-shaking strength and terrifying stature, individuals who had once ruled over the fragile human race like immortal, invincible kings, suddenly finding themselves utterly powerless against the cold wrath of the sky. They would have climbed the highest mountain peaks, their massive hands grasping at crumbling wet stone, their roars of defiance drowned out by the deafening thunder. But the waters kept rising, a dark, heavy blanket pulling the physical remnants of an abominable relationship down into the suffocating, lightless depths. For all their incredible power, for all their supernatural heritage, they could not fight the ocean. And floating solitary above this watery graveyard, suspended gently between a weeping sky and a drowned earth, was a single wooden vessel, Noah's Ark. This large boat carried the very last refuge of uncorrupted humanity, floating atop a world that was systematically being wiped clean. Inside the dark, pitch-sealed hull, surrounded by the nervous breathing and restless shifting of the surviving animals, sat Noah, a man explicitly described as perfect in his generations. This profound description meant that not one unholy breath, not one microscopic trace of the fallen angel's genetic interference could be found in his lineage, either in his past or his present. He was the golden standard of human purity, the untouched, pristine seed from which a new, uncontaminated world was supposed to grow. The divine plan was beautifully simple in its devastating severity. Erase the corrupted, tainted canvas of the earth and start anew with flawless colors. But water, for all its purifying power, is a deeply mysterious element, It washes away the dirt, it drowns the wicked, but it also obscures what lies silently beneath the surface. As the endless storm raged on outside, beating relentlessly against the heavy wooden planks of the only sanctuary left on a dead planet, a quiet, chilling reality may have been taking shelter right inside the very vessel meant to preserve humanity's ultimate purity. Imagine the atmosphere inside that colossal wooden structure as it drifted aimlessly upon a drowned planet. The air would have been thick, heavy with the scent of wet timber, melting pitch, and the restless breathing of thousands of slumbering beasts. Noah, the patriarch, sat in the dim light of flickering oil lamps, resting in the absolute assurance that he had followed the divine blueprint perfectly. His blood was clean. His lineage was pure. But Noah was not the only human being breathing in the damp, claustrophobic air of that floating refuge. According to the ancient Jewish text known as the Book of Jasher, Noah had 3 sons who accompanied him into the darkness: Shem, Ham, and Japheth. These 3 men, carrying the righteous legacy of their father, were already married before the great ark was ever built. They brought their spouses with them into the belly of the ship, securing their safety from the crushing waters outside. But when we look closely at the ancient records, a strange, profound silence surrounds these women. Nothing at all is said about their wives. The scriptures offer us no names, no lineages, and no origin stories for the mothers of the New World. They are simply 3 anonymous women brought aboard, silent shadows standing beside the sons of a perfect man. Why does history forget their names? Why is the lineage of the men so meticulously recorded, while the roots of these women vanish into the mist of time? Is it merely the patriarchal nature of ancient storytelling, or is it a deliberate veil, a shadow cast over an uncomfortable truth? There was a loophole in the divine plan, a quiet vulnerability hiding beneath the surface of the waters. Could it be that one or more of these unknown women carried the very Nephilim DNA that the heavens were trying so desperately to wash away? Think about the countless unholy unions that had taken place between the fallen angels and the daughters of men before the rains began. The world was saturated with this forbidden intermingling. What if these wives were not towering giants themselves, but mere carriers of a diluted strain? To understand this, we must look at the quiet, invisible machinery of life itself. We must talk about genetic dilution. Science tells us that biological traits do not simply vanish in one generation. Imagine a single drop of dark, heavy ink falling into a vast, crystal-clear ocean. The ink does not cease to exist. It spreads, it thins out, it becomes entirely invisible to the naked eye, yet it remains fundamentally present within the water. The blueprint of the Nephilim, that unholy combination of immortal spirit and mortal flesh, could have been passed down in trace amounts through the ages. A woman could walk the earth with the stature of an ordinary human, possessing a seemingly normal life, while deep within her cellular structure, a dormant code lay fast asleep. Although entirely dormant, this ancient genetic memory is still present, waiting patiently in the dark, ready to re-emerge in sudden and unexpected ways. If one of these anonymous women, perhaps the wife of Ham, as many rabbinic commentaries suggest, descended from one of those forbidden unions, then the great ark did not merely save the lives of Noah's family, it also unwittingly preserved the very bloodline God had intended to destroy. The flood did not end the Nephilim story. it may have subtly, quietly restarted it. Imagine the slow, creeping realization of this truth as the waters finally receded, as the heavy wooden doors of the ark swung open and the survivors stepped out onto the damp, lifeless mud of a cleansed earth. The sky was clear, the storm was over, but the seed of the old world had survived the journey. The theory gains even more terrifying traction when we consider the strange, unsettling events that unfolded after the floodwaters had dried, specifically around what happened with Ham, the youngest son of Noah. The book of Genesis, in its 9th chapter, tells a peculiar and deeply uncomfortable story. Noah, now a farmer of the new earth, planted a vineyard. He drank of the wine, became heavily intoxicated, and lay uncovered within his tent. The text states plainly that Ham saw his father's nakedness while Noah was drunk with wine. Ham did not quietly cover his father. Instead, he witnessed the sight of his father's nudity and went outside to share it with his 2 brothers. When Noah finally awoke from his wine-induced slumber and realized what his youngest son had done, his reaction was not just anger, it was a volcanic, devastating fury. But strangely, Noah did not curse Ham directly. When Noah was sober, he became furious and explicitly cursed Canaan, the son of Ham. Noah cried out, declaring that Canaan would be cursed and that the lowest of slaves he would be to his brothers. Why such a harsh punishment for an offense so vague? Seeing someone in an undressed state, even a patriarch, hardly warrants the permanent damnation of an entire future bloodline. It seems that there was much more to the pronouncement than a simple breach of ancient etiquette. Many dedicated researchers and theological scholars believe that this monumental curse was not about a lack of respect at all. Rather, it represents a deep, profound bloodline contamination, with the Nephilim ranking high in that regard. How could this be? Perhaps in that moment of vulnerability in the tent, Noah realized something horrifying about his grandson, Canaan. Perhaps the dormant traits of the ancient giants were beginning to physically manifest in the boy. Or perhaps the phrase of seeing his father's nakedness is an ancient idiom, a polite veil covering a much darker, forbidden act that permanently corrupted the lineage. Whatever the true nature of the transgression, the curse was a desperate, angry attempt to contain an infection that had already taken root. If you doubt this chilling interpretation, simply look at what the pages of history reveal next. Centuries later, the descendants of Canaan, the son of Ham, grew into powerful, intimidating nations known as the Canaanites, producing giant offspring as well. The land of Canaan, the territory promised to the Israelites, became an absolute hotspot for towering anomalies, an undeniable echo of the pre-flood world. The dormant DNA that had quietly thrived in the dark belly of the ark had finally found room to grow again, stretching its massive limbs beneath the post-flood sun. The ink had reconstituted itself from the ocean. The shadows had survived the rain. Do you feel the weight of that survival? The idea that no matter how hard the heavens try to scrub the earth clean, the resilient, stubborn code of the forbidden always finds a vessel to carry it through the storm. Cast your weary gaze upward, away from the drying mud of the cleansed earth, and look deep into the vast, glittering expanse of the ancient night sky. For a moment, allow yourself to imagine that the stars scattered across the darkness are not merely distant, burning spheres of gas, but cold, ancient eyes, staring down unblinkingly at the fragile, fleeting theater of human existence. In our modern, illuminated arrogance, We view the cosmos as an empty, silent void, but the ancient minds knew better. They understood that the heavens were heavily populated, strictly guarded, and sometimes deeply envious of the warmth found only in the mortal realm. If the monstrous anomalies of the Nephilim did not physically survive the great flood by hiding in the dark corners of the earth, or by slipping through the quiet, microscopic vessels of human DNA, then a much more terrifying reality must be gently considered. If the Nephilim did not survive the flood, then someone must have recreated them. This chilling possibility is the beating heart of a concept known by many scholars and theologians as the second incursion hypothesis. To truly understand the weight of this idea, we must turn the brittle, forbidden pages of the apocryphal Book of Enoch and the Book of Jubilees, ancient texts that describe a group of magnificent, terrifying divine beings who came to earth in the days before the flood. They were known, quite simply and ominously, as the Watchers. Their very name implies their original divine mandate: to observe, to vigilantly record, to stand on the high celestial balconies and bear witness to the unfolding drama of mortality without ever crossing the threshold of interference. But eternity is a heavy, isolating burden, and the cold, perfect logic of the heavenly spheres must have eventually paled in comparison to the warm, chaotic, intoxicating beauty of the world below. Like we see in the canonical Bible, the Watchers described in the Book of Enoch took an uncommon liking to the women of the earth. Imagine the slow, agonizing descent of a celestial being, surrendering its immortal grace and its place in the eternal chorus for the heavy, beating pulse of earthly desire. They did not just observe from afar. They crossed the sacred boundary, falling through the atmosphere like silent, burning embers. And they did not stop there, but instead they proceeded to marry human wives and produce hybrid offspring. They willingly traded the quiet harmony of the cosmos for the desperate, messy reality of flesh, bone, and blood. But the profound tragedy of the Watchers was not limited merely to biological corruption or the physical birth of towering giants. When the realm of the divine crashes into the realm of the mortal, the impact leaves a deep, smoldering crater of unnatural evolution. In the haunting words of the apocryphal book, they corrupted creation with forbidden knowledge. What terrible, magnificent secrets did these fallen entities whisper into the ears of their human brides in the dead of the prehistoric night? They did not just bring their unnatural, towering seed. They brought the terrible architecture of civilization itself, sharing mysteries that the human mind was not yet ready to bear. The Great Flood was meant to wash all of this away, to drown the abominations and silence those forbidden, dark whispers beneath billions of gallons of rushing water. But the universe is vast, and the forces of rebellion are rarely silenced by a single storm. What if the prison of the dark abyss wasn't large enough to hold all the rebels? What if not all the Watchers were destroyed or imprisoned? The ancient scriptures themselves hint at a fractured and messy rebellion, suggesting that some were turned against themselves in battle, a celestial civil war echoing in the high, unseen atmosphere, where length of days would be denied to them. This means that the cleansing of the earth might not have been as absolute as humanity had hoped. The second invasion hypothesis suggests a narrative that is almost too bleak to comprehend as you drift toward sleep. It proposes that a second group of Watchers, or perhaps a new, restless wave of fallen angels, descended when the flood was over. Imagine the surviving generations of humans cautiously rebuilding their fragile lives on the fertile, silent mud of the new world. They looked up at a clear blue sky, feeling the warmth of the sun, believing that the terrifying wrath of the heavens was finally appeased and the nightmare had permanently drowned. But the sky is an open door, not with the roaring chaos of a global deluge this time, but with the quiet, seductive descent of a second angelic rebellion in the shadows of the night. Not only did they return, but they also restarted the unholy matrimony between divine beings and daughters of men. The cycle of corruption began completely anew, bypassing the watery grave of the first deluge entirely. The boundaries between heaven and earth dissolved once more, proving that while water can wash away the footprints in the mud, it can never wash away the desires that hide in the deep, ancient spaces between the stars. If the veil between the celestial and the mortal was indeed breached a second time, it suddenly illuminates the most terrifying, unexplained shadows lurking within the historical records of the post-flood world. Picture the ancient, sun-baked landscapes of the Levant, centuries after the great waters had allegedly wiped every trace of the Nephilim from the face of the earth. The descendants of the Ark had multiplied, forming nations and tribes that wandered through the shifting sands and rocky valleys, believing they had inherited a purified world. But the earth holds its secrets with a tight, unyielding grip. Imagine the profound, paralyzing dread that must have gripped the Hebrew spies when Moses sent them to look over the promised land of Canaan. These were hardened men, survivors of a grueling desert exodus, yet the report they brought back to their people was deeply chilling. They did not speak merely of fortified cities or formidable human armies. They spoke of nightmares walking in the daylight. In the book of Numbers, their trembling words are permanently etched into history, declaring that the land they explored devoured those living within it, and that all the people they saw there were of great size. They explicitly stated, with a terror that echoes through the millennia, "We saw the Nephilim there." They elaborated that the descendants of Anak, a formidable tribe occupying the region, came directly from the Nephilim. The spies confessed that they seemed like mere grasshoppers in their own eyes, and they knew they looked exactly the same to the giants who stared down at them. How could the word Nephilim even be spoken so long after the divine reboot? This terrifying encounter perfectly explains the troubling consistency of giant tribes scattered across the Canaanite territories, distinct groups remembered in hushed, fearful tones as the Rephaim, the Imam, and the Zamzumim. And this dark, lingering presence did not simply fade away into myth. It culminated generations later in the terrifying figure of Goliath of Gath. Picture this towering Philistine soldier, a lumbering giant who derived absolute joy from taunting the Israelites and instilling paralyzing fear in their armies. He was no ordinary warrior. The scriptures describe his height as 6 cubits and a span, which translates to a monstrous, unbelievable stature of roughly 9 feet, 9 inches. When Goliath stepped onto the battlefield, his heavy footsteps shaking the dust, he was a living, breathing monument to a bloodline that the floodwaters had supposedly swallowed. How does a creature like Goliath exist if the heavens had not opened a second time to seed the earth with corruption? If you believe this returning nightmare is confined only to the biblical narrative, drift your thoughts eastward, toward the cradle of human civilization between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. In ancient Mesopotamia, where history was meticulously pressed into heavy clay tablets, their texts speak of a mysterious group called the Apkallu. These beings were described as half-human, half-divine sages who emerged to bring the gifts of civilization, law, and architecture to humanity after a great, catastrophic flood. Just like the Watchers, the Apkallu descended from the high realm of the gods, took a liking to the mortal world, married human women, and were ultimately punished by the chief deity, Enlil, for their transgressions. But the most unsettling detail, the whisper that keeps the scholars awake at night, is what happened next. After the deluge had washed the Mesopotamian plains, new Apkallu emerged from the shadows. This brought about a definitive second wave of divine human hybrids, walking among men and shaping the destiny of the new empires. Consider also the ancient lore of Enki, known as the trickster god of wisdom, who repeatedly defied the strict will of heaven in order to share forbidden, esoteric knowledge with mankind. In some versions of these archaic myths, Enki survives the Great Flood, while in other tellings, he simply returns from the ether once the waters have receded. When you lay these ancient stories side by side, a chilling, undeniable pattern begins to form across nearly every ancient culture on the planet. There is always a destruction by a flood, an attempt by the highest powers to cleanse the slate, which is inevitably followed by a return of divine beings who refuse to leave humanity alone. If the Apkallu returned to Mesopotamia, and if the trickster gods always find a way back to the mortal shores, what if it were exactly the same with the Nephilim? What if the towering anomalies that terrified the Israelite spies were not the remnants of a genetic loophole, but the direct result of a fresh, deliberate invasion from the stars? As you lie in the quiet dark, listening to the steady rhythm of your own breathing, ask yourself if the sky above you is truly as empty as science claims. If the barrier between the mortal and the divine was porous enough to be broken twice in our forgotten past, who is to say that the door was ever permanently sealed? Perhaps the giants did not survive the water. Perhaps they simply waited for the earth to dry before stepping back down into the mud, ready to begin their dark work all over again. When the sky breaks open and the atmosphere itself turns into a weapon of mass suffocation, where does a living creature run? Imagine the absolute panic of a world where the highest mountains are slowly being swallowed by a rising dark tide, and the terrifying realization that the heavens above have finally closed their doors to all pleas for mercy. For a hybrid species like the Nephilim, creatures born of forbidden celestial unions and possessing immense intellect alongside their physical power, standing on a mountaintop simply waiting to drown would not be their final act. An alternative route for their survival may have been far more desperate and far more ingenious. They went underground. The surface of our planet, the sunlit crust we walk upon with such blind confidence, is merely a fragile shell resting above a labyrinth of unimaginable depth and darkness. According to certain theological theorists who dare to look beyond the accepted dogma, the Nephilim were not totally wiped out by the crushing weight of the flood. Instead of facing the divine wrath of the rushing waters, they survived by retreating beneath the surface of the earth. Picture the massive, desperate exodus of these towering figures, abandoning the fertile green valleys they once ruled like immortal kings, and forcing their enormous, heavy frames into the dark, gaping maws of ancient cave systems. They sought refuge in the sprawling, lightless networks of caves, vast tunnels, and the theoretical expanses of the hollow earth. They descended into a realm where the deafening roar of the apocalyptic rain was gradually muffled by miles of solid, unforgiving bedrock, willingly trading the open, limitless sky for a claustrophobic, eternal night. This is not merely an isolated theory born from modern conspiratorial speculation. The story of giants hiding underground is old news and surprisingly universal across the fragmented memories of human cultures. If we cast our gaze to the spiritual traditions of the East, in Tibetan and Hindu lore, there are persistent, hushed whispers of a hidden, subterranean realm located deep beneath the icy, towering peaks of the Himalayas, a place known to the initiated as the Shambhala. This realm is often depicted in ancient manuscripts not just as a state of enlightenment, but as an elusive kingdom of shadows and ancient wisdom, a physical sanctuary untouched by the cyclical, violent destructions of the surface world. Is it merely a beautiful spiritual metaphor? Or is it the distorted, surviving memory of an actual physical refuge where a displaced race of enormous beings fled the rising waters? Even later, more modern traditions echo this deeply unsettling concept. The 19th century Agartha myth explicitly describes a massive sub-world hidden deep within the planetary crust, a kingdom completely ruled by citizens of terrific size and profound, perhaps forbidden, wisdom. Why do these stories persist with such stubborn endurance? Why do ancient cultures, separated by vast oceans, impassable mountain ranges, and insurmountable language barriers, share this exact same haunting memory of a civilization of giants living quietly beneath our feet? Let us look across the globe to the arid, sun-baked mesas of the American Southwest, where the indigenous Hopi people hold sacred ancient traditions speaking of previous worlds that were systematically destroyed by divine decree, including a world washed away by a relentless, great water. In their deep ancestral memory, survival during these global purges was only possible by retreating into the deep belly of the earth. They speak reverently of the Anu Sinum, the ant people, mysterious subterranean entities who supposedly opened the ground and guided the chosen few down into deep, cavernous sanctuaries, while the surface was violently purged. While the Hopi speak of these beings as benevolent saviors, the underlying geographical motif remains identically terrifying and completely aligned with the survival of the giants. The earth is hollow, it is navigable, and it harbors life when the surface becomes a flooded graveyard. Could these vast, cavernous sanctuaries be the very same tunnels that the Nephilim utilized to escape the divine judgment? As you lie in the quiet, undisturbed comfort of your room, feeling the heavy stillness of the night wrapping around you, consider the solid ground beneath your floorboards. We walk with such profound, unquestioning confidence upon the earth, assuming it to be a solid, impenetrable sphere of dead rock and molten iron. But what if the bedrock is actually riddled with hollow spaces, echoing, cavernous chambers, and silent subterranean rivers that have never seen the light of the sun? What if the descendants of the Nephilim simply escaped to the only place the floodwaters couldn't reach? Down there, in the crushing, absolute silence of the deep earth, the very concept of time loses its meaning. Without the rising and setting of the sun to mark the passing of days, Without the changing of the seasons to signal the march of years, centuries would simply bleed into millennia in a continuous, unbroken twilight. A hybrid species trapped in the dark would have to adapt, their eyes slowly growing accustomed to the pitch black, their massive bodies navigating the intricate, damp stone corridors of a world entirely alien to the one their celestial fathers had coveted. The Great Flood was meant by the divine to be a watery, inescapable tomb for the corrupted flesh, but perhaps it simply served as a heavy, liquid lid, sealing these towering anomalies into a sprawling, subterranean prison of their own desperate making. They were permanently removed from the chessboard of the surface world, banished from the sight of the heavens and the memory of humanity. Yet they remained down there, breathing the cool, stale air of the caves, surviving against all odds and waiting in the dark. The terrifying implication is that they did not perish, but simply became the silent landlords of a world we are too terrified to explore, listening to the faint, muffled footsteps of humanity walking unknowingly above their head. If the sprawling, subterranean labyrinth of the deep earth truly served as a permanent, lightless sanctuary for these displaced, towering anomalies, we must ask ourselves a deeply unsettling question. Did any of them ever dare to climb back up the dark, winding tunnels toward the warmth of the sun? Imagine the suffocating isolation of the underground centuries, the slow, creeping desperation that might drive a starving, exiled bloodline to cautiously breach the surface of a world they once ruled, seeking the open air and perhaps seeking the flesh of the ordinary men who had unknowingly inherited the earth. To explore this terrifying possibility, we must let our minds drift away from the ancient, mythological sands of the Middle East and travel to the desolate, sun-scorched expanses of the American West, specifically to the harsh, unforgiving desert landscape of Nevada. Here, the earth is dry, cracked, and infinitely silent, holding its secrets beneath layers of alkaline dust and jagged rock. Long before modern roads carved their way through the desolate valleys, the indigenous Paiute people roamed this land, gathering around their campfires under a vast, star-choked sky, passing down oral histories that were not merely fairy tales, but desperate warnings. They spoke in hushed, fearful tones of a tribe known as the Site-Ka, a name that roughly translates to the tool eaters, but their diet of marsh plants was not what made them terrifying. According to the deep ancestral memory of the Paiute, the Site-Ka were not ordinary neighboring humans. They were a vicious, hostile tribe of towering, cannibalistic giants who possessed a shocking, unnatural feature: a thick mane of flaming red hair. These beings were described as monstrously tall, incredibly strong, and relentlessly cruel, waging a constant, brutal war of attrition against the smaller, fragile indigenous tribes, snatching men, women, and children from the shadows to feed their unnatural hunger. The legends detail a harrowing, desperate war for survival, culminating in a final, dramatic siege, where the united Paiute tribes managed to drive the last remnants of these red-haired nightmares into the dark, gaping maw of a cavernous refuge. The Paiute warriors, refusing to follow the monsters into the suffocating darkness, piled massive amounts of dry brush at the cave's entrance, demanding that their ancient enemies surrender. And when the giants roared their defiant refusal, the humans set the brush ablaze. The thick, acrid smoke billowed into the cavern, filling the lungs of the towering anomalies, choking the life from the very beings who had once terrified the surface world, until the roaring flames finally reduced the cavern to a silent, blackened tomb, sealing the legend away in the ashes of the Nevada desert. For generations, modern historians and academic scholars dismissed this violent, incredible story as pure folklore, a colorful, exaggerated myth created by a primitive culture to explain the harsh realities of desert survival, until the cold, undeniable physical evidence violently breached the surface of modern history. In Lovelock, Nevada, a small cave near the Humboldt River became the epicenter of one of North America's most bizarre archaeological controversies. The year was 1911, an era driven by industry and unearthing the resources of the land, when a pair of guano miners named David Pugh and James Hart stumbled upon thousands of artifacts hidden deep within the shadows of that exact same cavern. They were not explorers seeking the mythical Nephilim, nor were they archaeologists delicately searching for lost civilizations. They were simply laborers digging out massive, heavy layers of bat guano to sell as agricultural fertilizer. But as their shovels bit deep into the accumulated filth and dry dust of the centuries, they began to strike things that did not belong in a simple animal den. They unearthed intricately woven baskets, incredibly preserved ancient tools, animal decoys made of reeds, and then, resting in the suffocating darkness, they found the bones. The miners froze in the dim light of their lanterns as they uncovered massive skeletal remains that defied all known logic of human biology. According to the startling early reports that quickly leaked from the dusty excavation site, these skeletons were not just slightly taller than average men, they measured over 9 feet tall. As the miners brushed away the centuries of dirt from the oversized, heavy craniums, they were met with a sight that perfectly, terrifyingly mirrored the ancient Paiute campfire warnings. There was red hair still clinging to the skulls. The physical reality of these monstrous remains was so shocking that newspapers caught fire with the story, blasting the impossible discovery across the front pages and sending ripples of disbelief through the quiet, ordered world of early 20th century academia. The evidence was not limited to just one isolated, mutated individual. The Nevada State Journal also reported 2 decades later, in 1931, that 2 more skeletons, one 8 feet tall, the other an unbelievable measurement of over 10 feet, were unearthed in the nearby lake beds, suggesting a widespread presence of these colossal beings. The sheer scale of the discovery began to materialize in the form of physical artifacts that accompanied the bones, items that were far too large for any ordinary human hand or foot to utilize. Local museums, like the Humboldt Museum, actually held tangible samples of this impossible history, displaying fragments of the giant sandals and massive bone fragments that had been carefully pulled from the ash and guano of Lovelock Cave. Imagine standing in the quiet, dusty hall of that local museum, staring through the glass at a woven sandal that is large enough to belong to a creature of nightmares. What happens to the rational, scientific mind when it is suddenly confronted with an object that fundamentally breaks the established laws of human evolution? Does it simply reject the evidence, writing it off as a clever hoax or a misidentified animal bone? Or does it feel a cold, primal shiver of recognition, a dormant genetic memory whispering that the monsters of the ancient world were absolutely real? If the Nephilim retreated underground to escape the roaring waters of the Great Flood, it is entirely plausible that thousands of years later, their genetically diluted yet still terrifyingly massive descendants, the Saiteka, were the ones who crawled out of the dark, only to meet their end by the smoke and fire of humanity. The red hair could have been a localized genetic mutation, a strange marker of a bloodline that had been completely isolated in the dark for millennia, desperately clinging to existence long after their celestial fathers had been imprisoned in the abyss. They were the tragic, monstrous stragglers of an ancient war, trapped in a cavern in Nevada, breathing their last, choking breaths as the ordinary men they had hunted finally took their violent revenge. But the bones were found. The giant sandals were held by human hands. The red hair was seen in the dim light of a miner's lantern. The legend was abruptly, violently pulled from the realm of mythology and placed directly onto the cold, hard tables of modern reality, challenging everything we thought we knew about the prehistoric timeline of the Americas. As you lie there, drifting closer to the edge of sleep, think about the sheer volume of earth that remains unexplored, the countless deep caves and sealed caverns scattered across the lonely deserts of the world, and ask yourself how many more silent, towering skeletons are currently waiting in the pitch black, their long, heavy bones wrapped in the dust of a forgotten apocalypse, patiently waiting for a careless shovel to finally bring them back into the light. But as the frantic, astonishing echoes of the miners' claims rang out from the dark, dusty caverns of Nevada, they inevitably crashed against the cold, unyielding walls of modern academic scrutiny. The realm of science is fundamentally built upon the rigid, uncompromising pillars of observable evidence and peer-reviewed consensus, forming a systematic cage of rationality that serves to protect the fragile human mind from the terrifying, unpredictable chaos of ancient mythology. Mainstream archaeology, acting as the organized, vigilant guardian of our collective historical timeline, tells those who wish to believe in monsters to halt their racing imaginations, stating clearly and firmly, "Not so fast." When confronted with the deeply unsettling whispers of towering, red-haired skeletons pulled from the layers of bat guano, most respected experts and university scholars immediately attribute the Lovelock discoveries to mundane, ordinary human flaws, exaggeration, misinterpretation, or outright hoaxes. Consider the frantic, sensationalized atmosphere of the era. The year was 1911. A time when yellow journalism reigned supreme, and newspapers frequently manufactured astonishing tales of the macabre and the impossible simply to sell a few more copies to a gullible, hungry public. The academic consensus argues with a calm, clinical detachment that the so-called giant skulls pulled from the depths of the dry earth were not the remnants of an ancient, celestial bloodline, but were highly likely derived from large Native American individuals, their physical proportions tragically distorted through generations of wild storytelling and the flickering, unreliable shadows of local rumor. A bone viewed in the dim, yellow light of a kerosene lantern by a terrified, exhausted miner can easily take on monstrous dimensions in the theater of the mind. Furthermore, for decades, persistent, paranoid rumors circulated through the shadowy corners of alternative history, suggesting that a massive, centralized academic institution had swooped down into the Nevada desert, confiscating the anomalous bones and permanently locking them away in deep, subterranean vaults. This theory proposed a deliberate, coordinated cover-up designed to protect the safely established narrative of ordinary human evolution. Yet, in the year 2014, the Smithsonian Institution, the most prominent and respected repository of American history, officially and categorically denied ever possessing giant skeletons from Lovelock or from anywhere else on the planet. Their curators and scientists maintain with absolute certainty that their vast, climate-controlled archives contain only the accepted, verifiable timeline of ordinary, fragile humanity, completely devoid of towering mythical anomalies. But the human desire to find the extraordinary is a stubborn flame, and researchers often shift their gaze to other desolate corners of the globe, seeking the elusive proof of the giants. They look toward the high, arid altitudes of the Andes Mountains in South America, where the thin air and dry earth perfectly preserve the dead for millennia. For many years, alternative historians pointed with desperate hope to the mysterious red-haired mummies recovered from the dusty tombs of Peru, beings possessing strangely elongated skulls that many ardently believed to be the undeniable physical remnants of the Nephilim. However, when the cold, precise, and unforgiving tools of modern genetic science were finally applied to these ancient remains, the results were decidedly, almost disappointingly, ordinary. Comprehensive DNA tests conducted on these specific red-haired mummies from Peru, individuals once thought to be definitive proof of the Nephilim, showed absolutely nothing outside the recognized range of normal human variation. The microscopic genetic markers did not point upward to the stars, nor did they reveal a corrupted, fallen angelic lineage. They merely painted a quiet picture of ordinary mortal beings, living, adapting, and ultimately dying beneath the harsh mountain sun. The scientific establishment stands firm upon a foundation of biological reality, reminding us that, to the public eye, despite all the breathless internet rumors and the faded, yellowing newspaper clippings of the early 20th century, no verified Nephilim DNA has ever been officially recovered from the Earth. The ledger of accepted science remains completely devoid of monsters. To this very day, no skeleton measuring over 8 feet tall has been conclusively documented, properly catalogued, and peer-reviewed by the global scientific community. The cage of rationality remains completely locked, keeping the shadows of the ancient world neatly separated from the illuminated halls of modern biology. But as you lie in the quiet dark, listening to the steady rhythm of your own heart, you must ask yourself a deeply unsettling question about the very nature of this scientific certainty. Is this rigid framework of peer-reviewed evidence truly an objective lens through which we view the universe? Or is it a comforting, necessary illusion constructed to keep humanity from staring directly into the terrifying abyss of its own forgotten past? Consider for a moment the delicate, fragile architecture of human knowledge, a carefully constructed fortress built to keep the terrifying unknown safely outside the city walls. We sleep soundly in our comfortable beds, wrapped in the warm, heavy blankets of academic certainty, trusting implicitly that the guardians of history have correctly mapped the boundaries of reality. But what happens when the guardians are terrified of the dark? This quiet suspicion inevitably sounds the conspiracy alarm. What if the rigid denial of the mainstream institutions is not based on a lack of evidence, but is actually a deliberate, desperate defense mechanism? What if a massive systemic cover-up took place right beneath our unseeing eyes? The modern world operates on a very specific, meticulously tailored version of the past, an evolutionary timeline that places ordinary, fragile humanity safely at the absolute pinnacle of terrestrial development. with the government and the established academic elite deeply wanting to preserve the official narrative that giants never existed to start with, it becomes completely understandable, and perhaps even expected, that the inconvenient, terrifying giant discovery stories are quickly buried. Imagine the bureaucratic machinery quietly grinding into motion the moment a nervous miner or an amateur archaeologist unearths a femur the size of a grown man. The shadowy phone calls, the swift confiscation of anomalies under the guise of national security or institutional study, the subtle discrediting of the original witnesses, until the truth is buried deeper than the bones themselves. It is a terrifying thought, but one rooted in the deep psychological frailty of human systems. Try to visualize the profound, catastrophic impact of undeniable proof. If even one single giant skeleton were to be conclusively authenticated, if it were confirmed as absolutely genuine to the public, the shockwave would obliterate the foundations of our modern understanding. It could forcefully and violently compel history, science, and even theology to completely rewrite their long-held stories. Think of the sprawling, cascading consequences of that single 10-foot skeleton resting on a stainless steel examination table for all the world to see. The entire field of evolutionary biology, a discipline built upon the slow, gradual, and logical progression of natural selection, would instantly shatter. Scientists would have to explain how an entirely separate, massive hominid species, one possessing physical traits completely alien to the human family tree, managed to coexist, dominate, and then vanish without fitting into any accepted Darwinian model. The history books, the thick, heavy volumes that define the rise of human civilization from the dust of antiquity, would have to be thrown into the fire. We would be forced to admit that we were not the masters of the ancient world, but perhaps the subjects, the prey, or the genetic experiments of a towering, forgotten race. And the crisis within the hallowed halls of theology would be equally devastating. For centuries, many modern religious institutions have comfortably relegated the terrifying stories of the Nephilim to the safe, harmless realm of moral allegory and poetic metaphor. But if the physical bones were placed before them, the pulpit would tremble. The holy texts would no longer be viewed as mere parables, but as terrifyingly accurate, literal historical records of a time when the boundaries between the celestial and the physical collapsed into a nightmare of blood and bone. Facing such a monumental, paradigm-shifting reality is simply unimaginable for the current architects of our society. A complete deconstruction of human origins would spark existential panic, religious upheaval, and a total loss of faith in the academic authorities who had sworn to protect the truth. And quite frankly, on a purely functional level, this is simply too much work for those currently in power. It is infinitely easier, far more comfortable, and incredibly safer to quietly lock a heavy wooden crate deep within a subterranean archival vault than it is to stand before the entire global population and confess that everything we have been taught since childhood is fundamentally, terrifyingly wrong. The inertia of massive institutions always favors the preservation of the status quo over the chaotic, disruptive revelation of a hidden universe. So the authorities look the other way, they dismiss the local legends, and they label the ancient bones as the tragic deformities of ordinary men. Still, despite the overwhelming weight of academic denial, despite the relentless efforts to scrub the anomalies from the official record, the stories don't die. They are incredibly resilient, possessing a strange, persistent life of their own. They keep surfacing, bubbling up from the deep, forgotten reservoirs of our collective unconscious. They are repeating across generations, whispered by grandparents to their children in the quiet hours of the night. They are constantly evolving, adapting their archaic details to fit the modern era, yet always retaining that central, chilling core of a truth too large to be entirely silenced. If the entire concept is merely a psychological glitch, a universal fairy tale born from the fear of the dark, we must confront one final, lingering question before we close our eyes. So if there is truly nothing down there in the dark earth, if the subterranean caverns are empty, and the ancient graves contain only the dust of ordinary men, why are so many entirely disconnected cultures so absolutely sure there is? As the shadows stretch across the walls of your room, let that question hang suspended in the silence, an unresolved chord echoing from a history that refuses to rest in peace. As we wander deeper into the labyrinth of our collective past, we must pause and confront a fundamental assumption that anchors our understanding of reality. We have spent so much time looking downward, digging through the dirt, searching for heavy bones, giant skulls, and tangible artifacts woven from the reeds of the ancient world. We rely entirely on the physical, the things we can touch, measure, and lock away in museum vaults. But what if everything we have assumed so far is fundamentally, entirely wrong? What if the true danger was never the flesh and bone to begin with? Look beyond the material realm for a moment. Some researchers and theologians propose a truly radical theory that shatters the boundaries of conventional biology. They suggest that the Nephilim were not just hybrid flesh and blood beings roaming the prehistoric landscape. What if the physical bodies of the giants, those towering anomalies of muscle and sinew, were merely temporary heavy vessels for something far more terrifying? They were spiritual entities. They were highly advanced, conscious beings, inherently not bound by the physical limitations of death, the devastating crush of the flood, or the slow, inevitable process of biological decay. To understand this terrifying concept, you must imagine the absolute, chaotic climax of the Great Deluge. Picture the torrential rains falling like heavy stones, the oceans rising to swallow the mountains, and the giant, desperate bodies of the Nephilim finally succumbing to the cold, crushing weight of billions of gallons of rushing water. Their lungs filled with the dark abyss, their massive hearts stopped beating, and the mortal half of their forbidden lineage, the half inherited from the fragile daughters of men, died in the mud. But the other half, the divine spark passed down from the celestial watchers, was entirely immortal. In other words, they did not survive the flood because of genetics, hiding their DNA within the wooden walls of the ark or fleeing to subterranean caves. They survived the end of the world simply because you cannot drown a spirit. Imagine the eerie, profound silence immediately following the flood. The waters receded, leaving behind a barren, lifeless landscape covered in thick, silent mud. Below the surface lay the ruined, rotting skeletons of the giants. But hovering above the water, completely untethered from their destroyed physical forms, were the conscious minds of the Nephilim. According to the ancient, forbidden texts of Enoch and the deep, esoteric writings from early Jewish mysticism, the Nephilim's physical bodies were completely destroyed by the deluge. but their spirits were most certainly not. They were caught in a horrifying, eternal limbo. They were denied entry back into the high heavens because of their corrupted, abominable nature, yet they no longer possessed the physical bodies required to dominate the earth. Instead of fading away into the ether, they became restless, intensely malevolent forces, forever doomed to wander the desolate, changing landscapes of the earth. This agonizing state of spiritual homelessness, this eternal hunger for the physical sensations they had violently lost, is not a new or isolated concept. In fact, this precise scenario perfectly matches the core description of demons found in multiple, entirely disconnected ancient traditions scattered across the globe. They are universally understood as disembodied, tortured spirits desperately seeking warm, living hosts. In this chilling view of history, the Nephilim are not an extinct species of prehistoric giants whose bones are slowly turning to dust in the Nevada desert. They are not gone. They are just invisible. And worse, much worse, for the unsuspecting generations of humanity that followed the flood. They are still incredibly active. Without their towering bodies of flesh to conquer and intimidate, these ancient, angry spirits had to find a completely new method to interact with the physical world they so desperately craved. They could no longer crush a human army with massive stones or weapons of bronze, so they learned to bypass the physical defenses entirely. Some dedicated scholars and theologians firmly believe they now operate through the insidious, quiet mechanism of possession. That is, rather than walking alongside us in the daylight, they embed themselves invisibly within the complex structures of human society. They hide within vulnerable humans. They attach themselves to powerful ancient bloodlines, or they weave their malevolent consciousness directly into the vast systems of global power. Think of the darkest, most inexplicable chapters of human history, the moments when ordinary men suddenly committed acts of such profound, staggering cruelty that it defies all psychological explanation. We often blame madness, greed, or the chaotic nature of humanity. But what if those individuals were not acting alone? These modern-day carriers of the ancient spirits may not even consciously know they are serving as a host for a disembodied giant. They go about their daily lives, holding positions of influence, making decisions that affect thousands, yet they consistently exhibit certain, highly specific and terrifying traits. You can see the shadow of the ancient world in their actions, an unquenchable, absolute thirst for control over others, a mastery of emotional and political manipulation, a cold, calculated cruelty that lacks any human empathy, and sometimes a strange, undeniable, supernatural charisma that blindly draws the masses to follow them into devastation. When you look into the eyes of history's most ruthless tyrants, dictators, and architects of suffering, are you truly looking at a flawed human being, or are you catching a fleeting, terrifying glimpse of a Nephilim spirit pulling the strings from behind the veil? This dark, spiritual hypothesis is not just a collection of modern, speculative mythology. It perfectly, seamlessly mirrors the most serious and terrifying practices documented throughout human history. It echoes the frantic, desperate incantations found within ancient Sumerian exorcism texts, where priests would burn herbs and chant in the dark to drive out unseen, towering entities from the bodies of the afflicted. It forms the absolute bedrock of Christian deliverance theology, where the battle against demonic forces is treated not as a metaphor, but as a literal, ongoing war against ancient, disembodied principalities. And remarkably, this exact same pattern of invasive, non-physical control even bleeds into the strange modern phenomenon of UFO abduction lore, where victims consistently report feeling paralyzed, observed, and manipulated by highly intelligent, cold, and invisible entities operating entirely outside the boundaries of our known physical reality. The methods change, the cultural vocabulary shifts from era to era, but the underlying terror remains perfectly consistent. Once again, as the night deepens around you and the rational defenses of your waking mind begin to soften, the ultimate terrifying question arises from the darkness. Are we merely dealing with ancient, restless spirits mourning their drowned bodies? Or are we confronting something far stranger, an intelligent, coordinated, and invisible infection that has been quietly steering the entire course of human history since the waters of the Great Flood finally receded? But what if we step even further away from the realm of floating spirits and invisible demons and look deep within the microscopic architecture of our own physical bodies? What if the terrifying influence of the Nephilim doesn't require a literal, supernatural possession from an outside entity? What if the ghost is not haunting the room, but is intricately woven into the very fabric of the haunted house itself? What if the lingering shadow of the ancient giants is deeper, structurally built into our very psychology? To grasp the immense gravity of this idea, we must briefly look at the quiet, invisible revolution happening within modern biology. For decades, science taught us that we only inherit the physical hardware of our ancestors: the color of our eyes, the shape of our hands, the predispositions to certain ailments. But some pioneering researchers have turned their attention to the idea of genetic memory, unlocking a controversial but rapidly growing field of study suggesting that we can actually inherit far more than just physical traits. We are now beginning to understand a concept known as epigenetics, which is the study of how behaviors and environment can cause changes that affect the way your genes work. Imagine your DNA as an ancient, massive piano. The keys themselves do not change, but the way the song is played, the heavy, dark chords that are struck, can be passed down to the next generation. It means that the profound trauma of a starving ancestor, instinctual, paralyzing fears of certain predators, and even complex, destructive behavioral patterns may be quietly passed down epigenetically through the dark corridors of time. A grandmother who survives a terrible war does not just pass down her bone structure. She passes down the biological echo of the falling bombs to a grandchild who has never seen a battlefield. Now, dare to imagine this exact same biological reality applied to the Nephilim and the survivors of the Great Flood. Even if their massive, anomalous DNA didn't survive completely intact, even if the towering height and the red hair were slowly bred out of the human population over thousands of years, perhaps their dark, consuming urges did survive. Think about the defining characteristics of those ancient hybrids, the traits that caused the heavens to weep and the floodwaters to rise. It was their insatiable, brutal lust for domination over the natural world, their dangerous, unnatural obsession with forbidden knowledge, and their absolute, arrogant rebellion against the divine order of the cosmos. These were not just bad habits. These were the fundamental psychological pillars of a corrupted species. What if those exact same terrifying tendencies still echo loudly through us today? When you look out at the sprawling concrete empires of the modern world, what do you truly see? You see humanity constantly pushing beyond the natural boundaries, desperately trying to rewrite the codes of life and death. Could this invisible, epigenetic inheritance explain humanity's persistent, almost pathological fascination with ancient giants, the creation of genetic hybrids in modern laboratories, and the rapidly approaching horizon of transhumanism? Transhumanism, the ultimate desire to merge human flesh with cold technology to defeat mortality, perfectly mirrors the ancient Nephilim's state of being. A hybrid entity defying the natural limits placed upon mortal men. How else do we explain our endless, ravenous hunger for absolute power, our desire for complete planetary control, and our deep-seated, unspoken yearning for becoming gods ourselves? We build towering monuments that pierce the clouds. We split the atom to harness the fire of the sun, and we relentlessly conquer the earth with the exact same arrogant cruelty that was once attributed to the fallen ones. It is a chilling, paralyzing thought as you lie in the quiet dark. The realization that the Nephilim are not just colorful monsters locked away in our ancient myths, but they are active, breathing participants in our minds. They are not just walking unseen among us in the shadows of the world. They are whispering directly into our beings and silently guiding us towards the same inevitable destruction that once claimed them. We are the living vessels of their unholy ambition. But, as always, when the shadows grow too long and the implications become too terrifying, the rigid guardians of modern rationality step forward to close the door. Mainstream scientists quickly and decisively dismiss this entirely. In the brightly lit, sterile halls of academia, there is no proven, peer-reviewed framework for spiritual genetics or the literal, biological transfer of a corrupted consciousness across hundreds of thousands of generations. To the modern biologist, the idea that a prehistoric obsession with forbidden knowledge can be chemically coded into a human chromosome is absurd. Grand theories of biological possession or the reality of inherited demonic traits are almost always lumped into the marginalized, disrespected category of paranormal pseudoscience. It is far more comfortable for human society to believe that our endless capacity for cruelty, our wars, and our greed are simply the tragic missteps of our own ordinary evolution, rather than the successful parasitic survival of an ancient, monstrous race. Yet, the theory maintains an undeniable, powerful traction in religious and paranormal communities, places where the dark corners of the human experience are not simply dismissed by a lack of a microscope. In these circles, the ancient stories of unbreakable ancestral curses, the preservation of occult bloodlines, and the reality of generational spirits attached to families are taken incredibly seriously. They understand that some darkness does not wash away with water. It simply sinks deeper into the soil of the soul. And the longer these unsettling legends survive the scrutiny of time, the longer they mysteriously repeat and resonate across completely disconnected cultures around the globe, the harder they are to ignore. A myth cannot survive for 10,000 years unless it contains a core of undeniable, resonating truth. Whether the survival of these entities is to be taken as a literal, biological infection of the human genome, or merely as a profound, symbolic representation of our own darkest, most destructive capacities, the ultimate conclusion remains the same. The Nephilim may have indeed found a brilliant, terrifying way to live on. They secured their immortality not entirely by hiding in our physical blood, but also by embedding themselves permanently within our behavior. So as you listen to the silence of the night, perhaps the monsters of the ancient world never truly left us at all. Maybe they didn't drown, and maybe they didn't hide in the deep caves of the earth. Maybe they just changed form, trading their towering bodies of flesh and bone for the quiet, invisible corridors of the human mind. What do you truly think as the quiet, heavy blanket of the night finally settles over your weary mind? Which of these ancient, whispered theories seems the most likely to you as you drift slowly toward the peaceful edge of sleep? Was it the desperate, scrambling underground escape of a dying hybrid breed into the hollow, lightless cavities of the earth? Or the terrifying, silent second incursion of celestial beings falling from a clear, post-flood sky? Or perhaps the answer is something else entirely, a darker, more intricate truth that our conscious waking minds are simply too fragile to fully comprehend. As the steady, comforting rhythm of your breathing aligns with the slow, ancient ticking of the cosmic clock, allow yourself to release the desperate human need for absolute certainty. You do not need to solve the profound mysteries of the deep earth or the starlit heavens tonight. Let the haunting echoes of massive, heavy bones shifting in the alkaline dust of Nevada mingle seamlessly with the imagined deafening roar of the great floodwaters and the quiet, insidious shadows that constantly hide within our own modern, relentless ambitions. The boundaries between ancient myth and genetic memory, between the physical remnants of the past and the spectral influences of the present, are far more porous than the illuminated waking world ever dares to admit. Do not fear the unknown, but rather let it wash over you like a gentle, dark tide pulling you out into a calm, silent sea. The history of our world is not a sterile, perfectly categorized museum hall. It is a sprawling, dimly lit labyrinth where the ghosts of the ancient giants may still wander, entirely unseen, right beneath our sleeping feet, waiting patiently for a time that has yet to arrive. Tell us your thoughts in the quiet spaces of the comments below, and leave a like to help guide other wandering, curious souls into our nocturnal sanctuary. As you finally let go of the waking day, keep your minds wide open to the impossible. Let your wandering thoughts drift weightlessly through the endless, fascinating corridors of the cryptic realm, and rest easy in the comforting knowledge that some secrets are perfectly safe when left undisturbed in the dark. Close your eyes. Surrender completely to the soothing silence of the deep night. And until we meet again to explore the shadows of forgotten history, sleep well and good night.